Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. I'm delighted to have Reuel Khoza as my guest today. I first met him decades ago through our mutual friend, Professor Laurie Schlemmer, when Reuel was running one of his first companies and did some work for the Urban Foundation. Since then, he's been chairman of Eskom, chairman of Nedbank, chairman of the PIC, and numerous other institutions. He's also an author, a farmer, and an entrepreneur. Welcome, Reuel. It's great to have you here. Reuel? Reuel, we can't see your picture.
Yes, sorry. Can you see my picture now?
Yes, we can. Great. Can you hear me? You're with us.
I'm with you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Great. Great.
And, I was just about saying that I'm delighted to engage in some conversation with yourself. And as you say, you know, we have known each other for decades now, brought together, as it were, by, amongst others, our mutual friend, the late Professor Laurie Schlemmer, under whom I studied for a while. So, and following that, in fact, I got to work with you and others, I think, in a variety of ways. We used to do some bit of research for the Urban Foundation in aid of the sterling work that you did as you worked for the Urban Foundation.
Great. Well, it's good to have you. I'm going to jump right in. I know you love choral music and that you played a big role in the growth of this in South Africa. How big a phenomenon is it? And do you sing yourself?
It's a huge phenomenon. I used to sing. I used to conduct choirs. And as you correctly pointed out, I organized a choral estate for Dow for some 8 to 9 years for major corporations that they actually use that as a vehicle to promote themselves as conscientious corporate citizens, essentially because they recognize the power of music, the power of choral music inter alia, but also other genres, whether you're talking jazz, whether you're talking soul, whether you're talking even kwaito or statamia. Music is a universal language. It's very, very powerful, it's impactful. Where South Africa is concerned, for the 10 years that I was promoting choral music, in fact, we reached the entire country, the breadth and the length of the country, entertaining, but also at the same time informing. During the struggle, you may recall that some of the struggle stalwarts conveyed the South African story through music. Yuma Sikela, Miriam Makeba, Kaifa Siminya, and Leta, Jonas Gwangwa, and the list is endless. And they became real ambassadors for South Africa during those heydays of apartheid. The Statamia group of Ladysmith Black Mambazo has gone a long, long way in conveying us as a country and putting us on the map. And so did the choral music groups like Imilo Gigantu, the Soweto Gospel Choir, and lately the Ndlovu Youth Choir. Those who don't know where we are get to know exactly where South Africa is and what it stands for through music, inter alia choral music.
Great. Well, you certainly educated me on this. I'm going to start gently. You've argued that the philosophical traditions of Africa offer an important contribution to the theory and practice of leadership in the world today. Now, many years ago, a well-known businessman Saki Makazoma told me that Ubuntu was a concept that Black South Africans used to intimidate white South Africans, but really it had little content or any originality. I think you see it differently. So what exactly can African culture contribute to how we think about leadership in the modern world?
Now, first of all, knowing Saki Makazoma well, he's a friend, a close friend and a colleague with whom I worked over the years. I bet he must have said that in jest. You cannot say that Ubuntu has no content. Ubuntu is the African philosophy of life. It is the worldview that many Africans actually operate from within. Ubuntu is a philosophy which provides us with a departure point in relating to the rest of the world. It is based on the belief that there is something wholesome in being a human being who cares about other humans. It extols the virtues of human interdependence. And taken from that vantage point, in fact, we can take on even some of the Western philosophies, such as that espoused by René Descartes, the Cartesian philosophy that argues cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It would actually see that as a very, very limited worldview. You cannot say the fact that you think makes you who you are. In African philosophy, what makes you who you are is how you interrelate to other humans. It takes into account the fact that you have no independent existence, as it were. That even the language that René Descartes actually used, he learned from the time he was sitting on the lap of his mother. And through socialization, through schooling, through studying philosophy himself, reading other people. So there is no such thing as an independent existence. So the philosophy of Ubuntu will be predicated on the dictum, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. You only find true human expression in the context of other human beings. You have no independent existence, as it were. If you become so individualistic as to be rabid, in fact, you hurt not only yourself, but the other humans. So existentially, Ubuntu is key. It is the basis of Afrocentricity, which is the departure point for relating to other humans in the world. The philosophy has even found itself into our own constitution. Not only that, the philosophy has actually found its way into the code of behavior that Mervyn King and some of us actually had to work on from the Institute of Directors' vantage point. And it now permeates a great deal of South Africa and Africa's thinking. It cannot, therefore, be devoid of content. It cannot, therefore, be a khocha that Africans actually use to intimidate white people. If anything, it is a philosophy that embraces humanity, including the white people that are purportedly intimidated by its mention.
Okay, well, you and I will have to debate that with Saki one day.
Certainly.
A few years ago, you said that, and I quote, "No Black person can feel that the majority of companies are truly open to Black ownership, control, and promotions through the ranks. We still confront a caste system." So my first question is, do you still believe this? And what is the evidence for that?
In large measure, I still believe that, because I believe South Africa has not transformed substantially in racial terms. If you look at corporate South Africa today, in managerial ranks, still upward of 60% of managers in major corporations are drawn from the wide segment of the population in a country that is only about 8% white. That cannot inspire confidence. That cannot inspire an embrace of South Africa having changed substantially. So I would say that, in fact, we still have a long way to go. And proper analysis, looking at this thing with an eye that scrutinizes, would still conclude that there is still excessive dalliance amongst our white compatriots to draw white managerial talent largely from the white segment. Because otherwise, by now, some 25, 30 years later, following independence, South Africa should have normalized to a point where upward of 80% of its managerial class are Black, and we're nowhere near that. And for that reason, I would call to question anybody who would say that the situation is in any way wholesome.
So when you were chairman of Nedbank, which you were for 9 years, and you sit on the boards of many big companies, what have you been able to achieve to change this dynamic? What do you think needs to be done, bearing in mind not only our terrible history of discrimination, but also our appalling education system? So what were you able to do as the chairman of these boards to change this situation? Do you think you made a difference?
I should imagine so. I'll take the two examples that you have actually mentioned, starting with Eskom. When I joined Eskom, it was a highly indebted corporation. The debt equity ratio, and that was in 1997, by the way, the debt equity ratio was 3-1. And by working with my colleagues, both Black and white, in a manner that is catalytic, in a manner that is cooperative, in a manner that is consultative, 5 years later, we could boast a number of things. In 2001, 2002, Eskom was rated above the sovereign, which effectively means that we were more credit-worthy than South Africa Incorporated. And this rating was with a respectable rating agency, Moody's. But not only that, the debt equity ratio had reduced to 1-1, from 3-1 to 1-1. And by the time I left as chairman in 2005, the debt equity ratio was 0.18, which effectively says virtually debt-free. But not only that, in terms of management, by the time I left, of the 12 leaders in the C-suite, i.e. your executive management, 10 were Black and 2 were white, almost mirroring what you might call an ideal corporate South Africa. But what is of even greater importance is that in terms of productivity, we were producing a lot more per capita. And we had even reduced the numbers from 66,000 shortly before I joined Eskom to 32,000. But productivity was the highest then. And some of the stuff that we are experiencing now with blackouts and stuff like that did not even exist in the vocabulary of South Africa. So there is a sense in which I believe I left a legacy. And perhaps let me just emphasize the fact that no chairman can do this of their own individual steam. The African philosophy actually goes on to say that inkosi ngabantu, a king cannot be a king without vassals. And that is an extension, as it were, of Umuntu Ngabantu. So a chairman is a chairman by dint of the support that he gets from the board, by dint of the support that he gets from the colleagues throughout the organization. So when I talk about the kinds of things I'm talking about at Eskom, it's not an individual effort. It was a collective effort with all of us hands on deck, essentially because the philosophy of the chairman was one that said, be competent, also be ethically sound in terms of the ethical conduct, but went on to say industry and diligence are wholesome values. And people actually bought that and applied themselves. In fact, in 2002, we even went so far as to declare a dividend of 1.6 billion rands to the state, which was our shareholder. So that's one example. But where Nedbank is concerned, in fact, when I joined in 2005, the company was in the doldrums. It had to be rescued in large measure by its mother body, namely Old Mutual. So at the time, in fact, to take just one index, the share price was below 80 rands. When I left in 2013, the share price was hovering around 249 rands. And that doesn't happen without effort, without cooperation, without inculcating and eliciting cooperation from your colleagues. By the time I left in Nedbank, the board was largely transformed. The C-suite was deracialized. There were almost as many executives, as many Black executives as there were white executives. I am told that today, perhaps even as we speak, the board comprises 15 members. And of the 15, 10 are Black. And of the 10, 4 are women. So I want to believe that to some extent, one has been party to introduce the kind of transformation that the country sorely needs. Unfortunately, you cannot talk about that as being pervasive in corporate South Africa. A great deal still needs to be done.
So is it because management replicates itself and people are more comfortable with people who like them? Or do you think, what is the problem in corporate South Africa, if you're right? I'm often surprised when I go around to many South African boards and executives at how things have changed. Not perfect by any means, but we're certainly in a very different position from where we were. So what do you think is the key reason we aren't in a better situation?
Well, first, I didn't say things have not changed. I said in large measure, we still have a long way to go. There are a number of reasons why things have not changed as fast as they should have. One has to do with what you referred to in terms of our educational system, where high schools and universities that were meant for Black people were designed to produce deficient human models. And to actually fight that successfully will take a bit of time. It will take perhaps a generation. Your observations in some of the companies may very well be right, but I think it gets subsumed and rendered not adequate by what happens in many other companies. In my capacity as a director and as a member of the Institute of Directors, as its president, I interface with many companies. I talk to many companies. I visit many universities even as a visiting professor. My experience would actually attest to the fact that some changes have taken place, but nowhere near enough. And some of the reasons have to do with the educational system, as I was saying. Others have to do with the proclivity, the natural proclivity of people wanting to appoint those that look more or less like themselves. So if you rock up and you look very, very different, and your worldview also may be somewhat different. For instance, I mean, if you rocked up with dreadlocks, even though you may actually be having a fantastic brain, many will be anxious about whether or not you'll be able to fit. In the 80s, when I worked with yourself, amongst others, I actually ran a number of change programs for the likes of IBM. And it came to light that many people tended to mistake corporate culture with European or Western culture. And those are not synonymous. Corporate culture is corporate culture, and all of us have got to be encultured into that. But the tendency is to say, no, we are of the same culture because we are of a Western orientation and we are white. Mm. In reality, even that is a falsehood. There are many examples that one can actually give there. We get socialized through acculturation, through enculturation, which is what you learn from your environment, and through acculturation, which is learned from what you learn from other environments. So corporate culture is a form of acculturation. And as a consultant, I did a great deal of that. And the changes or the transformations actually are quite apparent from those early days in the mid-1980s to today.
Good. Well, some progress, but not nearly where we want to get to.
Okay.
Let me move to a very different issue. You've said that the current impasse in socio-economic development in South Africa is partly due to the unholy alliance between the ANC and the Communist Party. You see the communists as the tail that wags the ANC dog. And they're not elected, in your view. You've been quite strong that, in your view, it's time that the Communist Party understood they're not co-governing South Africa. I would argue probably time the ANC appreciated that as well. This is such an important issue, and it's one that very few people like to talk about or think about. I've often wondered, when does the ANC, qua ANC, meet on its own without its alliance partners, who certainly meet on their own without the ANC? And I think it gets to the root of some pretty fundamental issues. What is your view? Why do you feel so strongly about this?
First, you do have communists in government, but they have not gotten in there of their own steam. They have used the ANC as a Trojan horse. Now, if they fundamentally believe in their ideology, why is it that they don't hive off and campaign as the SACP? There must be some hesitancy, and that hesitancy bespeaks a certain doubt in themselves. Now, I think one comment that one can make is that what hamstrings the ANC, resulting in what you have referred to as my having said at one stage that the Communist Party is the tail that wags the dog, it's because the two are ideologically at variance. Nobody can gainsay that. It's nationalists versus communists. But one might ask the question, but so what? In economic terms, that is not unimportant. The ANC would tend to gravitate towards a mixed economy, which is what we relatively have currently. And the communists would actually gravitate very, very strongly towards socialism. Now you wind up with a situation where the nationalists might say, perhaps let's cooperate with corporate South Africa. And those of a communist inclination might argue, yeah, but be very, very cautious because this is the monster of capitalism. If anything, we should actually bash them to changing their worldview and adopting our communistic outlook. And unless they actually do that, they remain an enemy. So you can't cooperate. I mean, the cooperation between corporate South Africa and political South Africa is crucial. In fact, they should actually be in perfect tango in order for us to actually really prosper. But then there are those within the ruling elite who are communistically inclined and who still see big business, even those that are somewhat enlightened, and there are many that are enlightened, who still see them as this capitalistic monster that at all times does things that are inimical to the rest of humanity. And because of those cleavages, you wind up with a situation where the tail that wags the dog actually befuddles and obstruct what would otherwise be an optimal cooperation that would augur well for progress.
Well, we're going to come back to that issue in a roundabout way. You've said that the future of South Africa will be brought about by leaders who dare to be unorthodox, not those who procrastinate. So let's get to the nub of it. What is your view of the current president of the country? After all, he has said that the unity of the ANC is more important than the future of South Africa. How do you see this situation?
I think with respect, it is somewhat irresponsible to say that the unity of the ANC is more important than, if you like, the welfare of South Africa at large. You can't say that. Political organizations come and go. Political leaders, even pseudo ones, come and go. The nation lives forever. So the nation is, infinitely more important than any political party can ever hope to be. In spite of the fact that presidents, including the former president, that preceded Mr. Ramaphosa, even went so far as saying that we will rule or govern until Christ returns. That's the worst form of hubris that anybody can utter anywhere on the globe. Perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, your question is, what about the current president? The current president has a fine stature. He's well educated. He's extremely presidential, even as he stands up to say something. And he's even worldly in terms of what he has been able to achieve continentally and on the globe. But unfortunately, in my observation, and this is the observation of just one citizen, he has a number of shortcomings, if you like, handicaps. For one thing, I think he is irresolute. An effective leader has to be decisive. You cannot prevaricate for any extended period of time. For another, I think I agree with what Winston Churchill said, that you can have all the characteristics of leadership, but if you lack courage, particularly the courage of your own convictions, don't step onto the leadership plate. And I must say that in my humble observation, the current president does lack courage, certainly does not have adequate courage to say to those who may be doing things inimical to his own cabinet, things inimical to his own party. So courage to say, this is where I stand, if for any reason you don't agree, you are at liberty to actually hive off and start your own little movement and to go in competition if need be. I am afraid he is also too ameliorative and accommodative, almost to a fault. And that cannot augur well for the country, as it were. You might say perhaps he has learned a few lessons from the likes of Lyndon Johnson of the US, who said, if you allow the vulgarity and the French in our conversation, who said, rather have your enemies inside the tent, sort of peeing outward, as opposed to having them outside peeing inward. In a sense, that is actually fundamentally flawed. If you have enemies that want to pee for whatever reason, let them go and do that elsewhere, nowhere near your tent. So my worry with the president is that he allowed those who were clearly opposed to what it is he stood for and wanted to actually implement. He allowed them to white-end him from within. At times, even using the national budget to travel to places to organize for things that actually satisfy their own ends and not the end of the ANC. Neither would that be the end of the country, because right now we need to be led by one party that is bold, and it was trying to do that, but it was white-ended from within. And most of this is becoming very, very apparent now that we're moving towards December. And I want to add that there is nothing indispensable about a political party. Leaders and pseudo leaders, as I said earlier on, come and go. The nation should survive, endure, and prosper almost forever.
You also said once that leaders with no moral authority do not have the right to hold positions. Is this the case with the current government, in your view?
I believe there's a modicum of moral authority, but there is a sense in which I believe it is inadequate. In my humble opinion, anybody who wants to lead, maybe political, maybe in business, needs to stand on at least two major pillars. The first one is competence. If you're not competent, don't even have pretensions of wanting to step onto the leadership platform, because chances are you'll mislead or you'll do something inimical to what leadership should be about. So competence is key. And secondly, I would say ethical conduct, because without ethical conduct, you will get to be not only self-aggrandizing, you'll be self-enriching, and you'll do things that are actually inimical to what your leadership behoves you to do. Now, flowing from those two pillars, I would say come issues of integrity, come issues of capability to actually lead, come issues of responsibility, a sense of responsibility that says, I am here and I'm responsible for the following, but also coupled with accountability. And in the wake of that, add fairness, add in that also transparency. Now, all of those, as I look at my current leadership, I find that to varying degrees, they lack in that. And they need to beef up where that is concerned.
And one of the things that puzzles me about South Africa is I don't get a sense of real urgency from government about all the terrible challenges that we face, from unemployment to security issues to power issues, which we'll come to all those issues. And you have said that, you know, South African leaders should acknowledge that they're standing on a burning platform with crises on almost every single front, and all of them getting worse. Why is there this lack of urgency to deal with the fundamental challenges that we have? Is it because any real action will deepen the fractions in the party and perhaps lead to a split? Or what is it in your view?
I think there may be a variety of reasons or factors, but I think the key one is hubris. It is easy to be lackadaisical when you are blinded by political vanity. So people get to be political and vain. In other words, they get blinded by saying, now we are the most important thing that happened to humanity since sliced bread. And that actually really blinds them. Hubris is the enemy of leadership. You have heard, as I said earlier on, the president saying, we shall rule or we shall govern you until Christ's return. Now, you can only say that if your vision goes only as far as the tip of your nose. But if you think generationally, if you think in a manner that says, as a leader, you're not only responsible to your party, you are responsible for the nation, then things like those, statements like that should never find themselves into the public. But I do find that essentially because I believe such leadership, particularly the leadership of the president who actually said that, wants to lead without the necessary conceptual basket to think about, to utilize. They want to go and fix a mechanical problem with a toolbox that is empty. The intention alone won't fix what it is you want to fix unless you have a toolbox full of tools. So there is a sense in which if you want to lead in the 21st century, you must have the conceptual tools that enable you to deal with complexity. You must have the conceptual tools that enable you to grapple with the phenomenon of globality and globalization, because that's where you operate. You must be equipped with a conceptual basket that has concepts that say, as a political leader, you are in fact leading in a political economy, and that politics and economics must be in perfect tango in order for them to deliver. Now, my worry is that a good number of those that I've interfaced with may have read a few slogans in politics, but have not actually studied economics. But somehow they want to lead a political economy. It's bound to be skewed because those two have got to go hand in hand. Leading in the 21st century also behoves one to understand the need for ethics, as I said earlier on, because if you don't have a sense of ethics that enable you to have ethical conduct, intelligence alone or some measure of confidence alone is not going to be helpful. And we have learned lessons from our own neighbor across the Limpopo. If you are looking for intellect, Robert Mugabe was one of the most intellectually gifted, but he has no sense of ethical conduct. He had no sense of at your service leadership for the whole of the population of Zimbabwe. Behold where Zimbabwe is. And further, behold what might actually
Does
befall
everything have to be in order?
Hello.
Sorry, we're here. We're here.
So anyway, I think I've made my point where that is concerned. Yeah, I think
they can't act with urgency because
one,
most of the time they don't know what to do. Is that what you argue?
That's essentially what I'm saying. You can toy your way to some kind of leadership, but unless you have a conceptual basket full of concepts that will enable you to think and grapple with the challenges, you are akin to the mechanic with the pseudo mechanic with a toolbox that is empty, but has a good intention to go and fix a problem.
Right, right. Well, let's turn to one problem which must, I think, infuriate you, but let me not put words in your mouth. I'm keen to not spend all the rest of our time on this, but very briefly, what would you be doing about our power situation? How would you fix Eskom and more broadly the broader situation? What's gone wrong? What do you think we should be doing now?
Oh, and for that, we actually need at least a day. We need a week. We need a month because it's a huge conundrum. In 2018, together with a few Eskom people, we approached a number of Eskom senior executives that are actually working for utilities elsewhere in the world, and they are doing a sterling job of it. And said, we have a problem back home. Do you think we can actually approach government and ask them to call you back home? They said, no, South Africa is still our home. We would actually serve notice and come back home to come and help. And this was a substantial group of plus minus 6 people, still very, very active, very knowledgeable, a good number of them with electrical engineering as their area of study and area of practice. And I said, no, we could come home. And we approached this together with one, well, a number of my colleagues, I don't know if I should mention names, my former colleagues at Eskom, and said to government, we would recommend that you recall these people or call them back home. And we believe they would actually be transformative at Eskom. And we were brushed aside with gusto. Now, I must also admit that later on, the president did approach me and said, do you think you could be chairman of Eskom once again? But it was at a time when I was chairing PIC. And I said to him, I'm in glaring awareness of my limitations. I can't handle the two at the same time. And having started with PIC, I plead with you to leave me right here to do what it is you requested me to do. So I couldn't, agree to going to chair Eskom. So efforts have been made by ourselves and others. Unfortunately, the others who are making the recommendations are political foes, as in another political party, that actually have argued that South Africa has engineers, civil, if you like, electrical, if you like, and all the other forms of engineering that would actually be quite happy to be of assistance if only government was accommodative and invited them to have hands on deck. And even that is regularly brushed aside. So what I would do if I were given a chance today, which I would not take because I believe I've done my bit. First, I'll make sure that I do a thorough analysis of what the problem is, because I don't know what the problem is today. And you can't just move in and assume that the solutions that you came up with in 1997 to 2005 would be adequate to this problem. So I would wish to understand in depth the nature of the problem. And having done that, I would go for skills that would actually be up to that assignment. And fortunately, this country is actually blessed with those kinds of skills if only we care to look for them. And I would match the two and give them scope to tackle the problem. And I would, as I insisted in 1997, I would insist that the shareholder behaves as a shareholder and not as part of management. I remember actually telling one of my ministers that, Minister, if you are going to interfere with succession planning here, with skilling and multi-skilling of the people here, come in and I'll go out. I don't have to work here. And the minister actually desisted from doing that ever until we parted ways, and unfortunately he's deceased now. But I want to believe that if you have a solid board, they can tell government not to come in at all. Give me the mandate and let's enter into a compact, but stay out. Let me run the organization and ask me questions at the AGM. And if I'm not delivering, fire me and get those that will deliver.
It is beyond belief that we sit with the board that we currently have with little or no engineering capacity. And well, I think now suddenly the government is sort of starting to act on that, but you have to ask yourself why it's taken so long to get there.
I think it's tragic, Anne, because, you know, if you look at the kind of board we had a number of civil engineers who were actually running major corporations in the mining industry. And the mining industry was one of the segments of the market that we were servicing. So they would actually make contributions with understanding. We had international electrical engineers that ran utilities in the Scandinavian countries on the board. We had an engineer from West Africa on the board, knowledgeable people. We had chartered accountants on the board so that they can actually look at and scrutinize the numbers on a regular basis, not only when you are about to write your financial statements. So all of that made for a robust debate and a robust engagement in governance by the board. Now, there are other forces at work that actually go for people who may be nice and cuddly, but not necessarily with the requisite skill to serve on the board. That's tragic.
That's tragic. Let me turn in the remaining time we have to business. In 2012, you were, I think, one of the first businessmen to speak out in the Nedbank annual report about South Africa's strange breed of leadership that seemed to be undermining the institutions that underpin democracy. And you argued that our political leadership's moral quotient is degenerating, and we are fast losing the checks and balances that are necessary to prevent a recurrence of the past. Now, your comments drew strong criticism from the ANC then, the then Minister of Police, the government's official spokesman, Gwedi Mantashe, who said you were irrelevant and unpatriotic, Bladen Zamandi, chairman of the SACP, and cabinet minister then and now, accused you of reckless comments. What were the consequences for you of speaking out? Were there any? And how did this play out for you, for your courage?
Yeah, let's start with positive consequences, or the consequences that one could live with joy. For one thing, the major shareholder applauded the stance I took. But not only that, as we were building up to the AGM, there are those who felt that perhaps some other shareholders and stakeholders would agitate for the termination of my chairmanship. I was voted back into chairmanship by upward of 90% of the shareholders. That was lower than the usual, because the usual was 98, between 98 and 99%. So there is a sense in which perhaps something like 6 to 8% may have been a little bit unhappy with the stance that I took. Now, the ultimate test of whether or not you have been corrosive or erosive as a chair and you need to be punished is consumers quitting. Now, we monitored that very closely. 2 or 3 customers of Nedbank in Pietermaritzburg actually came to one branch and said, we are withdrawing our support because of what the chairman said. None beyond that. We retained all of our share of our customers, and in fact, later on, when we engaged the ANC, some of the ANC members said they were customers of Nedbank, and they were not about to move their accounts. So there is a sense in which, in their hearts of hearts, in spite of all of those ministers that actually were very vitriolic, very bitter, at times condescending and derisive, which is not becoming of a leader. If you disagree, you just disagree without being derisive and being insulting to anybody who disagrees with you. And there are those who said I should actually withdraw the statement. I said, I'm not withdrawing any statement, because I made that statement in glaring awareness of what it is I was articulating. And well, they called me all of those names. They came up with all of those castigations. But let's suppose we had a more magnanimous government, and they just called me aside and said, Cham, tell us more. Let's engage. And we would have debated, perhaps to a point where they could have seen the other side of negativity that was eroding our political economy, that was eroding our democracy. And who knows what we experience later may perhaps be averted. I'm not saying that I was a prophet of any kind. I was just a business person who was observant of things developing. So what lessons can our current leadership have? If you have critics, don't castigate them and put them aside as if they were enemies. It could be that there are things they can see that you can't see. Even the most visionary of all of us do have blind spots. Recognize that and accept your limitations. And your limitations can only be diminished by you being accommodative of ideas that may not necessarily be the same as yours.
So here we are today. The country is in terrible situation. As you and I would say, crises on every front. Do you think business is speaking out enough? Are they being bold enough, talking truth to power? How do you see business leaders, organized business today? Any advice you would give, or what are your thoughts on this?
I must say, organized business in particular, and perhaps a few individual business leaders, are a lot bolder today than they were then. If you take the chief executive of Leadership SA, I think she's extremely knowledgeable. She takes trouble to study trends, study the situation, and she steps forward boldly with views that may not necessarily be very popular with the authorities that be. If you take the president of BUSA, his president or chairman, I believe he's president, he's very, very bold. He stands up and speaks truth to power without wavering. If you look at the chief executive of BUSA as well, in a very, very quiet, diplomatic, but incisive way, speaks truth to power and engages the leadership that be. And so one can go on. I must say that lately, business is a lot bolder. Business is a lot more articulate in calling to book those that purport to be our leaders, but might be bungling.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Let me ask you this. Would it be better for South Africa? Is the ANC redeemable? Would it be better for the country if it split? Not just nationalists and communists, but let's say people committed to probity and the Constitution and those not. How do you see that?
The ANC has split before. And I don't know if that was a solution. And the question you ask is it redeemable? Can it be salvaged? I think most parties can, in fact, be salvaged. They go through a roller coaster up and down, but what it would need is very, very bitter medicine. What it would need is very, very deep surgery. What it would need is amongst its own ranks and from outside, have people that will step to the plate boldly and stand for something, as opposed to saying, well, I stand for unity that unifies the unifiable. You know, if you cannot unify that which is resistant to unity, and you have artificial unity, you harbor enemies in your own house in the name of unity. If things go pear-shaped, don't be surprised, because you have enemies outside, you also have the enemy within. So I think this party, I mean, I've been voting for them and been fighting for the ANC underground to the point of being fired from university. My first job was as a university lecturer. I love the organization, and I worked with real stalwarts. I lament the fact that it seems to be on a downward spiral. But having said that, I believe it can be redeemed. Deep surgery, bitter medicine.
Does deep surgery mean being kicked out of power, which is what former President Kgalema Motlanthe is reputed to have said? That's what's required. That's how parties get deep surgery.
Or even if they lost support in very large measure, they'll wake up to the challenge of the time. But hubris, as I said earlier on, was the enemy. People tended to be megalomaniacs. I mean, only a megalomaniac, only somebody who is a little bit unhinged will say, regardless of whatever happens, I'll govern till Christ returns. I mean, how on earth?
and the party went along with it at the time. So, Reuel Khoza, thank you very much for spending an hour with us. This has been a fantastic conversation, and it's been fascinating to learn more about your views on leadership and many other things about South Africa. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, and keep up the good work at CDE.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. This conversation is over. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Reuel.
Thank you.